Welcome to the Frankly Speaking podcast, Friends of Europe's weekly broadcast on the topics of European and world affairs. Coming up this week.
When you put together, Finland in the air and on land and Sweden in the air and on the sea, it's quite self-evident why the whole Baltic Sea region is actually quite happy that we're joining. I am quite convinced that eventually Ukraine will win this war.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Frankly Speaking podcast brought to you by Friends of Europe. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Fellow in the Peace, Security and Defence Programme, and our special guest this week is Alexander Stubb, who is Director Professor at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, and was previously Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Finance Minister, Europe Minister, and Trade Minister, I hope I haven't missed any, of Finland. So we're going to talk to him a bit about developments in Finland, first of all, and then move on to the question of how the European Union in general is shaping up as the Ukraine war now goes into winter. So Alex, if I may ask you first, Finland has obviously crossed a Rubicon during this crisis and decided to join NATO along with Sweden. How will this change Finnish foreign policy and its role in Europe and the world? Finland's traditionally been a bridge builder between East and West. Can it still play that role?
No, definitely not. But I would actually argue that this is not a colossal change. I think we stopped playing that sometime at the end of the Cold War, beginning of the post-Cold War era, when we dropped the notion of neutrality, which was pretty much by necessity, not free will. And we chose our football team, so to speak. And that football team was Europe, the European Union, and a very close NATO partnership. And I've always said that, if you're out there on the pitch on one team, you can't provide the refereeing for the other. So it's not that big of a change. I think in Germany, it was actually a bigger change. They've talked about Zeitenwende, which has turned into Zeitenslalom. Whereas, in the Finnish case, we sort of just basically took where we left off. Remember, we didn't join NATO in 1995 because we would have probably lost the referendum. But we decided to integrate as closely into NATO structures as possible. And that meant that the actual step to full membership was quite easy. And remember, right now, we have over 80% of the population in favor of it. And the vote in parliament was 188 out of 200. So hands down, we're in there.
So as a NATO member, assuming that the last obstacles of ratification in Hungary and Turkey are removed, can Finland largely defend itself? Is it going to need a lot of help from the allies? And what is Finland going to bring in terms of additional security for NATO? Will you expect there to be troop deployments of NATO forces or bases on Finnish territory, or is that ruled out?
Well, the starting point is that we've always been able to defend ourselves. I mean, there's a reason when you have 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia, you always have to be prepared. And, on one hand, we were idealistic. We wanted to cooperate with Russia, but at the same time, we're realistic and maintained a obligatory military service. What do we bring into NATO? Well, 900,000 men in reserve. 280,000 that can be mobilized quickly at wartime. We bring 62 F-18s, just bought another 64 F-35s, one of the most sophisticated air-to-land and land-to-air missile systems. So in many ways, I think we're very much a security provider, a value added to NATO in the northeastern corner of Europe. And when you put together, Finland in the air and on land and Sweden in the air and on the sea, it's quite self-evident why the whole Baltic Sea region is actually quite happy that we're joining. But, if push comes to shove, we're of course able to defend ourselves. And I think we'll basically become a NATO member state without limit. So when you look at our accession agreement, it won't have anything saying that we're not going to deploy troops or we're not going to have nuclear arms on our soil. Those the types of decisions that you take later on. So consider us to be a very Norway-like NATO member. I think that's the category where I'd put us.
Okay, well that's pretty clear, especially since we know that Norway does still have some limitations in its northern region as to not having NATO troops directly on the border with Russia. Well, looking more broadly, how do you see the war in Ukraine playing out as we head into winter? How confident are you that the Europeans, among themselves and within the United States, can maintain the considerable level of military and financial support for Ukraine if the war drags on well into 2023?
Well, first of all, I'm quite confident that it will drag on to the latter part of 2023. So we are in this for the long haul. Secondly, I am quite convinced that eventually Ukraine will win this war. And thirdly, I'm fairly hopeful that European and American support for the war continues. Of course, the grunt has been borne by the US in terms of military and also actually financial assistance. But I think the way in which it's going to go eventually is, and I'm simplifying here, that the US pays for the war and Europe pays for reconstruction. Is there war fatigue in the air? Much less than I thought there would be. And the reason is very simple. For as long as Vladimir Putin and Russia continues to target civilians, civilian buildings, when we hear reports of mass graves, of raping women and children, the types of war atrocities and war crimes that Russia is providing, it's very difficult to turn your eye, your head away. So I do think that support will continue. Obviously, with time, it'll be a little bit softer. People start looking at themselves in the mirror. They look at their energy bills. They look at inflation. So I think essentially it's very important that European and US leaders communicate the price of war, or basically the price of peace. We have to pay for this, and it's going to mean lowering our living standards. I know as a former politician, it's not a comfortable narrative to tell your voters, but if you sort of preface that with pictures of what is going on, I think Europeans and all sensible human beings will have enough empathy and sympathy to help out.
So I very much agree with what you say. I think indeed it's Putin who's keeping us together so much, and the way and his conduct of the war and the brutality and the atrocities, as you say. I wonder just whether at some stage, having been united in war, we may become more divided over the peace. And you will have inevitably European countries that are very much, that have different definitions of victory. You say, we'll stay united until Ukraine wins the war, but different people see that as meaning different things. And I think, for example, if Ukraine were to launch an offensive to recapture Crimea, that would be quite divisive in Europe between those who would say that's entirely legitimate and it's occupied territory, and so they should, and those who would say this is the way to get us into a nuclear war. What's your feeling about that?
Well, nuclear war, I don't believe in. I think, the likelihood of that is very small. Obviously, we'll hear scaremongering about it, and it's good that we discuss the possibility. But I think the alternative cost, even for Putin there, is too high. He's many things, but he's not suicidal. And I think the messages we've gotten from the American administration that the counterattack would be forceful and swift will be enough to function as a deterrent for that particular option. Obviously, it won't be a retaliation with nuclear, but the Americans and the West haven't even really showed up in the war. The Russians are already now doing bad. Now, secondly, yes, there is in Europe a justice camp and a peace camp. The justice camp says this needs to be an overarching victory for Ukraine, which means taking back the occupied territories, including Crimea. And then there's a peace camp who says that, the cost of human lives is too high. We'll take peace at any cost. I think a good starting point for anyone who believes in the United Nations and in international law and the charters of the OSCE is to say that we start with that as a basis. And of course, if we do that, then we understand that territorial integrity and sovereignty hasn't been respected. and that means that we should allow Ukraine to push as far back as it can up until the borders of 2014. If that's not the case, then we can as well start talking about dismantling different types of international charters. So, and in my experience, the only thing that Russia or Putin understands is power. So in that sense, to give in any which way, then we're just going to have a copy paste of a similar situation, which essentially this is. If you look at the war in Georgia 2008 or the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, this time just Putin didn't get away with it. And it's us in the West that should be thanking Ukraine for it, not the other way around.
What do you think the main lessons of this conflict are for the resilience of the European Union and its economic stability? Will the EU, do you think, emerge stronger? You've said that we're all going to emerge poorer, at least in the short run. And will we be less dependent on countries like Russia or China for our energy and vital commodities? Or is that actually much harder than we may be saying and telling ourselves?
I mean, I'm sure there are many lessons. I mean, first of all, me, I'm a bit of an EU nerd. I've been doing this stuff as a civil servant, academic, and a politician for the past 30 plus years. I've never seen the European Union more united, nor have I ever seen it more determined or efficient, for that matter. I mean, and you can look at it in terms of sequence of crisis. Of course, we're comparing oranges and apples here, but one can't say that the Euro crisis was effective crisis management. It was slow, burdensome, and bloody painful. I still have the scars to prove it. We can say that Brexit was a useful crisis for uniting the European Union. We can also say that COVID was that, and Trump to a certain extent. And now the war in Ukraine is sort of the icing on the cake. And it's awful to say, but almost to a certain extent, the blessing in disguise. And the lesson that we learn is that, the more serious the situation, the more united the European Union is. Does this mean that we are going to live in some kind of a European utopia where everyone is agreeing on everything at all times? Of course not. There'll be a time when we'll be split again, and there'll be a time when we have disagreements. Quite often it depends a little bit on the situation. It depends on the political leader, and it depends also on the issues. So in finance, it was North versus South. In migration, it was East versus West. On Brexit, it was everyone versus the UK, and on COVID, it was pretty much, hey, we're in this boat together. So interdependency works inside the European Union, but of course, the lesson that we learned from Russia and our dependence on Russian energy is that it didn't work there. So, it's never a given to think that economic or any other kind of interdependence means automatically eternal peace. In the Russian case, it didn't. Will we manage to detach ourselves from Russian energy? Sure thing. Will this first lead to a dirtier consumption of energy in terms of CO2 emissions? Yes, it will. But in the long run, it will probably, I think, make the energy transition, the move towards carbon neutrality and Fit for 55 and the Green Deal much swifter actually than we believe. So in that sense, there's been a lot of good things to come out of this crisis as well from a European perspective.
Does it matter that we don't agree about what the solution for energy should be, that with some moving to lots of renewables with gas as the transition, imported American LNG mostly as the transition fuel, and others going more and more nuclear and saying that nuclear is really the answer, and with a bit of wind and solar to back it up. Does that matter, or can the EU live with that level of difference and diversity?
In the short term, it'll be a little bit painful, and it does matter. In the medium term, not so much, and in the long run, not at all. Because I think at the end of the day, we are going to meet at some kind of a compromise point, which basically means that perhaps out of this now, since the European Coal and Steel Community and Euratom in 1952, finally, we start getting some kind of an energy union where there is an agreement, not necessarily on which form of energy we use in a particular area, but at least the provision thereof. So Finland, I think, is a good case, and I'm not meaning to tap my country here on the back because I've been involved in some of the decision making, but take absolutely no credit. We have a very, I think, useful portfolio mix. which takes into consideration both the environment and security. So we have a nuclear power, we have renewables, hydro, among others. We did have some dependency on Russian gas, but it was 100%, but it was only 5% of our energy portfolio. So we were able to switch on to alternative grids. So I think eventually out of this will come something good. And I don't think nuclear can be considered an ideological issue anymore, as it was for such a long time. And I hope that we can now start developing nuclear technology, which basically has been at a standstill for ideological reasons for such a long time. So, as long as we keep on diversifying, I'm sure we'll meet at some juncture.
So I sort of agree with you on some of that, but I think that we are yet to see the full backlash from our own NIMBYs when we start up, more onshore wind, more nuclear power plants, and different, or to drill for mineral resources in our own countries instead of buying them from Russia and China. So I think that that's one constraint. The other constraint, which we haven't really sort of entirely thought about, I think, is that Germany has to find a whole new industrial and economic model. It is Europe's biggest economy, and it's the most industrial of our economies. And more than others, I think for Germany, it's going to be a very tough transition, and a very tough transition that will make potentially a rather difficult partner, because it will be so concerned for itself that it won't be too concerned about trampling on others if necessary.
Perhaps. Because Germany has, of course, been the leading light in terms of economic growth and industrial policy in Europe for a long time. But isn't it interesting to a certain extent that if you look at the coalition government in Germany right now, all three of them have had to do fundamental Zeitenwende in their own right. The SPD did it with security policy, the Greens did it with energy, and the Liberals had to do it with economy. So, in many ways, it was a blessing in disguise that the current coalition was there. But I don't know. Germany will not be as well. If you come from south of Europe, you're not going to say that, well, Germany was an easy partner to deal with during the financial crisis, whereas me from the north was saying, yeah, they were great. But this is sort of the pendulum of power. I think a lot more power is going to shift a little bit eastbound, towards Poland because of security reasons, and perhaps northeast as well, because of Finnish and Swedish NATO membership. But this is, normal movement in international relations. And I must admit that now that I'm an academic, it's much easier to come to terms with it and analyze it a little bit from the outside, if you know what I mean.
Actually, you now that you're up there in the helicopter, it doesn't look as bad. It does close up. I think I can agree with that.
Yeah.
What time for one final question? There's been a lot of talk in the last few years about the goal of European strategic autonomy. Somehow this war has sort of stood that slightly on its head, because people ran to NATO rather than to the EU for their security. And do you think the goal of European strategic autonomy is still important, or is it something that we need to modify and look more in terms of reinforcing NATO and the transatlantic relationship?
Well, I guess I'm very Aristotelian in this as well. So nothing in excess except moderation. So the whole idea that we could somehow become strategically autonomous and decouple ourselves from, say, American security, I think it's simply ludicrous. It's not even shooting yourself in the foot. It's kind of shooting yourself in the head. And I think we've seen this during the war in Ukraine. So, if strategic autonomy means Danone yogurt, then I'm definitely against it. But if it means the idea that we have to understand that, there's a certain pivot of American security towards the Indo-Pacific, we can see that actually in the fairly fresh U.S. document on U.S. national security strategy, which came out in October, and we have to understand that America is not going to be here forever. They're going to be here for a long time in various forms because it's in their strategic interest and because we share values. So that's not going to change overnight. But perhaps some kind of a more European NATO is what we should be really looking at. So no sort of duplication of systems and so on and so forth. So yes to strategic autonomy, but in moderation.
Alex Stubb, thank you very much. That's it for this week's Frankly Speaking podcast. Look forward to, hope you'll tune in again next time. Thank you.
That's it for this Frankly Speaking podcast. Consider subscribing to our newsletter or following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And don't forget to tune in again, this time next week.